Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk about what could be called the metaphysics of entropy. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about entropy as it's generally used in physics, so the second law of thermodynamics and the like, and then I'm going to extrapolate certain metaphysical concepts from these general laws, and um, and the two ideas or concepts that I've kind of been toying with and creating are the idea of transcendental anti-entropy and then low entropy. So, and what you're going to notice is probably some parallels between the two concepts of low entropy and the anti-entropy. And so, essentially, uh, entropy is often described in several ways. The second law of thermodynamics is described as being basically an isolated system that is increasing more and more in its state of entropy, so it's becoming more and more disorganized. It's becoming more and more, uh, disorganized than disordered. And that's a real phenomena in the universe that has been observed, which is the idea that indeed we're running out of energy, and the work that could be gained from that energy is heading towards a very high state to where eventually there's going to be no work left. There's just going to be basically, as they call it, like wasted energy or no useful energy. We're going to be at a strange state of being. I think, I, yeah, um, yeah. So the other idea that often plays into this concept is more local examples. So we have, for instance, an egg. So an egg, when it's uncracked, it's in a very organized state. But then when you crack the egg and pour it in a bowl, then it becomes less organized. And then when you scramble it, it becomes even less organized after that and more disordered. And so the idea is that essentially, in this localized example, the universe has moved more and more towards entropy. Another example is always the fact that you can pour coffee into milk, but you can't unmix it. So that's another good example of entropy. And then there's always the idea of a bed, a room, where the room through time gets messier and messier, but on its own, the room would never become cleaner and more organized, on its own at least. You could always put effort into it, but then entropy would still increase because you would burn calories and you would sweat and the like, and all of that is essentially energy being wasted. Now, what you're probably wondering what I'm going to extrapolate out of these two conceptions, or out of these conceptions of entropy, and I think that's a valid question. So first, let's talk about transcendental anti-entropy. So the idea that we're often led to believe is that the universe, or at least our world, if we want to talk more locally, is headed towards a higher and higher state of chaos. And so this is usually when we talk about chaos, we talk more about like maybe violence is increasing, or uh, accidents are becoming more common, like global catastrophes and the like are becoming more common. And so we're heading, and then degradation of society and so we take all of these like grand themes and ideas about like the universe becoming more and more disorganized, or at least our world becoming more and more disorganized. But in this idea of transcendental anti-entropy, I argue that the opposite process is happening. Um, I don't argue it to the extreme, though you could say that indeed, rather than the universe heading towards disorganization, we're actually headed towards organization. More specifically, I try to use that idea as um, the world as we know it heading more and more towards a state of preservation. And so, as there's a really good example in the book Boy's Life by Robert McCammon, where an arrowhead is presumed to be lost in a boy's childhood. He's a friend of the main character in this book. And essentially, the arrowhead is presumed to be lost, but then years later, they find the arrowhead again, and it's safe and it's completely fine. And so I'm using that as a metaphor for this idea that we have, or that we could potentially have, of transcendental anti-entropy, of things actually being preserved. So we think that whenever we make a mistake, that our mistake has actually contributed to the chaos of the world. We think that essentially the world is becoming more and more chaotic and disorganized because of our actions. but actually we're moving towards a state of preservation, and potentially you could argue that our universe is actually even becoming more and more organized, or at least our world. And I use that via the metaphor of the arrowhead. So like I said, we think that it's lost, but it's actually been preserved by natural processes. And so that's probably the best way to look at this idea of transcendental anti-entropy, which is that, at least in terms of like the social scale, or in terms of our fears about like all of the bad things that are happening in this world, and we think that they're getting worse, they're actually contributing to potentially a state of existence that is more and more organized. And I think that that's super important to keep in mind. Now, in terms of my idea of low entropy, this idea has been tossed around in physics a little bit, but it has more social ramifications. The idea is that high entropy represents the chaos of the world. So it represents perhaps all of the hostility that people have, it represents our neuroticism, it represents our confusions, and the like, while low entropy is basically just code word for love. Now, I want to start by, I started articulating this concept personally. It features in my book Griffin Feathers, which is my 5th novel, complete novel, and the chapter is called Low Entropy. And I kind of detail the idea, but it started from experience where one day I started thinking about what it would be like to have a child, to have a little kid, and I started thinking about how I would be affectionate towards them, and I started thinking about that I very well could be affectionate towards my kid, and how much I would love them. And it was a very peaceful thought. I described this experience to a friend because it was very spiritual, or at the very least metaphysical, and he described it as meditating. But in my personal experience, I would describe it maybe as meditating, but also as just being in a very calm state of being. A very relaxed state of being, and I felt like I was emanating an energy as I was just basically staring at a wall and thinking about what it would be like to have Griffin, Griffin's the name of the kid in the book, the main character. And I imagined Griffin being my kid, and I basically imagined like just loving the kid, and what that would be like to have this low energy, this low state of being, this low entropic state that was being exuded towards this kid. And so basically what I ended up taking away from it is this concept of low entropy, which is the idea that indeed low entropy is code word for love. But when you unpack that concept, what you're left with is that what we should do is we should try to contribute to the entropy of the world by not even contributing to it, because we try to bring the world back to a state of zero by having low entropy. And essentially this kind of breaks the traditional ways in which we look at entropy in terms of physics, because for there to be zero entropy, you would imagine that would be the ideal state, because it's not chaotic, and that even low entropy would contribute eventually to more and more entropy in the overall system. And so I kind of break away from that. It's kind of a little puzzle that I've never been able to fully solve, but I feel like it's still consistent within itself. But anyway, to continue, the idea is that essentially it's important to look at low entropy as energy, and to not conceptualize it as contributing to the overall to an overall state of high entropy, because we need to look at love as a kind of energy. And so again, to go back to my experience when I was thinking of having Griffin as a kid and what that would feel like, I was in a very low entropic state, and I wasn't contributing to all of the chaos of the universe. I wasn't contributing to the chaos that was happening around me, maybe not in my immediate vicinity, but around me. In general, I was contributing an energy that could be felt, and that could be appreciated, and that could be respected. And I think that that's what's important, and that's why I see this idea of low entropy and as code word for love important, because we have to look at love as a kind of energy. We can't look at love as just a feeling. We have to look at love as a kind of energy, because once we do that, it opens us in the sense that we're able to see all of the potential of what our love can do. That energy can act on people, that energy can create work, but instead of that work contributing to chaos and disorder or whatever, instead of burning calories or whatever, we're actually contributing to a lower state of existence and helping, I like to say, helping the universe go back to zero. And of course, all of this breaks away from entropy as it would be used in physics, but that's of course why these are metaphysical claims. And in metaphysics, you have that freedom to think about rooted concepts in different ways. And so the idea is that it is important to think of low entropy as code word for love, but it's important to think of that love as being a kind of energy because it can act on the world, and it's something that can actually be felt. It's something that actually exists. It's not just a concept that we create. And I think that that's why it's important. So to close, what you probably notice with these two concepts of the transcendental anti-entropy and the idea of low entropy is the idea that really what I'm saying is that the universe is, or at least our world, is not headed towards more and more chaos. It's actually headed towards a kind of organization, or it's headed towards a more peaceful state of being, a more peaceful state of mind, even if you want to look at it that way. And I think that that's more helpful than just watching the news and looking at all of the violence and thinking that the world's pretty much going to hell, as they say. And I think that both of these models provide a more positive way via metaphysics of looking at our world, and I think that that's super crucial. And yeah, again, this is Phoenix, and I hope you enjoyed this talk on the metaphysics of entropy. Thank you for your time.